everyone watching this has some form of this going on. Virtually everyone watching it. I don't know very many people that actually have a truly balanced life right now. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, that it's ubiquitous because it has to do with, in all of us, the production of dopamine and the opportunities for pleasure. And I'd really like you to explain a little bit of sciencey here of the neuroscience of the discovery and the implications of the discovery of dopamine, number one, and how that works with pleasure and pain. So we get a little foundation before we launch into the rest.
So dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain. It was discovered in the 1950s as a human brain neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. Neurons are these long spindly cells that conduct the electrical circuits that make us who we are, but they don't actually touch end to end. There's a little gap between them. That gap is called the synapse. And neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine are what bridge that gap to allow for fine-tuned control of those electrical circuits. Dopamine is essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. So when we do something that's reinforcing or makes us feel good, that releases dopamine in a dedicated circuit in the brain called the reward pathway. The more dopamine that's released in response to a substance or behavior, and the faster it's released, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be potentially addictive for us. People have different drugs of choice. For me, I thought I was immune to the problem of addiction because alcohol, caffeine, those things really don't have much of an impact on my brain. But romance novels and in general, reading and escape fiction is my drug of choice. Also, other people, I would say, I'm very prone to that whole category of, sort of relationships as both enriching my life, but also potentially an area where I can get kind of caught up and be compulsive. That's sort of how dopamine works, very broadly speaking. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. So like alcohol works by our endogenous opioid and GABA systems, but at the end of that chemical cascade, it releases dopamine. Cigarettes, nicotine, works via our nicotinic acetylcholine system, but at the end of it, it releases dopamine. And what happens when our brain releases, especially a lot of dopamine all at once, as we do in response to an intoxicant, our brain has to adapt to that. And our brain adapts by downregulating our own dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline tonic levels, but actually below baseline temporarily into what we call a dopamine deficit state. Now, if we wait long enough between use, eventually we start to regenerate more dopamine and we go back to sort of tonic baseline. But if we continue to consume that substance or behavior repeatedly, then that upward deflection gets weaker and shorter, but that downward response gets stronger and longer. And ultimately we can end up in a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state. And that now we're entering addicted brain, right? Because now we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high, but just to raise our dopamine levels to healthy, normal levels. And when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. And this is really important because patients will come in and they'll say, "Doctor, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. Can you help me?" I will find out that they're drinking large amounts every day or smoking pot every day, using other drugs, reading romance novels every day, playing video games every day, watching pornography and masturbating every day. And they'll say, "Well, I only do that because I'm self-medicating my depression and anxiety. And if you would just, treat that, I wouldn't do these behaviors." But the truth of the matter is that that may be initially the reason that they started that substance or behavior. But over time, because of this process of neuroadaptation, that initially high dopamine behavior or substance is actually driving their dopamine levels down and now exacerbating or causing that. So one of the first interventions we will do is actually have them stop that behavior for long enough to reset reward pathways. And very often when we do that, patients feel less depressed, less anxious, et cetera, without our having prescribed any pill or done any kind of psychotherapy.
I hope you're enjoying this video, because if you are, there are dozens more like it on my site, all supported by people like you. So if you'd like to keep this work rolling in and join our community, just click on the Patreon button at reginameredith.com. That also gives you access to insider commentary, my live book club, and other live events with special guests. So join in. Thanks. These pleasure-seeking patterns we're in are self-reinforcing in terms of the depression that follows, like you say, the anxiety and such that follows. And I mean, one of the big ones, certainly having a cell phone available, having social media where people are neurotically checking the phone many, many, many times a day, if not many times an hour. All of these things are included when it comes to this very complex of the way dopamine works in our brains, including streaming video at night. And I think COVID certainly threw the world into video streaming at night, which disrupts sleep patterns and everything else, right?
Yes. So digital images, moving images, digital drugs light up that same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. They release dopamine. If it's very potent and also long lasting, our brain has to accommodate that increased dopamine by downregulating dopamine transmission and production. And we eventually get less and less happy, right? We enter into this dopamine deficit state. And again, then it's, as you say, self-reinforcing, or we enter the compulsive loop, the addiction vortex, where now we're just using to bring ourselves back up to a normal baseline. Yeah, and I mean, that's why I really recommended to all my friends, and especially people with kids and even grandkids, to start understanding how this pattern works, because these little guys are born into this oversaturated world that's out of balance and pleasure seeking. So let's talk about one of your clients who he shows up throughout the book because he had an epic journey with sex addiction, and so wanted to be beyond it. And he would disappear for long periods and then show up again. Let's talk a little bit about sex addiction. And I want to segue that into what is going to happen when virtual reality, VR sex, becomes ubiquitous. What's going to happen to us as a species? Yeah. Well, I think it's already happening. We're already seeing some major epidemiologic trends in the form of younger people having less sex than they used to, probably in part because they're spending more and more time online, watching pornography and engaging in sexual acts online. So sex is highly reinforcing. Orgasm causes a flooding of these feel-good neurotransmitters in our brains. People can get addicted to orgasm, compulsive masturbation, viewing pornography, having sex, just like they can get addicted to drugs and alcohol. I do think that sex addiction is a silent epidemic in our country today, and probably in the world, especially among men and boys. Not that women are immune to the problem. You could argue I had my own version of a sex addiction, but the kind of sex addiction that's happening for men and boys online with compulsive viewing of pornography and compulsive masturbation is really at epidemic proportions, causing people to get depressed, anxious, suicidal, being non-functional, enormous shame and guilt, especially in the current climate of #MeToo, where young men in particular have a lot of trepidation about, approaching women in any context, and it's good that they're thoughtful about it, but, it's kind of escaping from the real life complexity of that by going online to satisfy their sexual urges.
And Joseph, he went to such extremes, and he even created a little machine that would help him stay on the edge of orgasm for hours and hours. His brain was perpetually flooded. Now that's an extreme, but use him as an example because it was such a wonderful example in the book.
Yeah, so he's a wonderful person. He was married, a very kind, thoughtful, bright person, a scientist, and he developed a very severe sex addiction, really a life-threatening sex addiction that ultimately led to his wife leaving him, almost losing a series of jobs, risking his life because essentially he built this masturbation machine that got more and more sophisticated and more potentially lethal over time. and talk about, shame and self-loathing and all of that. So he came to me desperately wanting help with this problem. And I'm glad to say that he did, eventually get into recovery with a lot of stutter steps. And he did that, by insulating himself from not just sex with other people on the internet and pornographic images and his machine, which he disposed of, but also connecting himself with people in Sexaholics Anonymous who were actively supporting each other, to abstain from these behaviors, and finding that in doing so that their lives were better, and that's what he did. And he's really a hero in my eyes.
Oh yeah, I loved his story because he was so sincere. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you might also want to consider joining Patreon, which allows me to keep all of this content free and available to everyone. And if you're looking for like-minded souls, you might also enjoy my online community called Our Neighborhood. Links to join are in the description.